So, having now seen the new trailers for Aquaman and Shazam, I would say that my overall opinion of the DCEU is unmoved. Honestly, these new trailers haven't shown me anything that the trailers for the last few DC movies didn't, and I'm still not all that excited or hopeful that they'll turn out any good. What I am really excited for, though, is to get into the final installment of my DCEU rant, dissection, I don't really know what to call it anymore. Yeah, it's been a long road and it's involved a fair amount of talking, explaining, and raging, but now we've come to the most recent films in the DCEU's lineup, and I am excited as hell to talk about them. We've gone through the worst of the bunch, and now we can actually start talking about some of the better DC films. Okay, the better film, I should say. But hey, I think I've ripped into this franchise enough by this point, haven't I? I mean, I can give credit where it's due. I can be nice every now and then, can't I? Well, let's see. Whereas Suicide Squad was easily the worst film in the DCEU's lineup, Wonder Woman, so far at least, is easily the best. While it has received some criticism from people trying to act all edgy by saying that they didn't like a film that everyone else said was great, Wonder Woman still holds up, especially compared to its predecessors. While I'm not going to try and pretend that the movie is without fault, the good aspects most certainly outweigh the bad. For instance, unlike Batman v Superman, the movie doesn't get bogged down trying to set up the next 15 movies after itself, and unlike Suicide Squad, it manages to balance a slightly darker tone with some genuine human emotion, humor, and feeling. Also, unlike every other movie in the DCEU, Wonder Woman is the only movie to remember where the most valuable elements of storytelling are within its characters. Wonder Woman focuses entirely on the journey of its main lead, showing her going from a naive innocent with a black and white mentality surrounding the nature of good and evil to seeing the grey areas in between human nature. It's a character arc which works, and it makes a whole lot of sense for this movie.
Still looking at you, Batman v Superman.
The movie also does a better job of handling its darker subject matter. Unlike Batman v Superman, which was trying so desperately to be serious and dark without actually dealing with any subject matter which warranted such a tone, Wonder Woman deals with a lot of heavy subjects, with World War I serving as the backdrop for the story. I mean, having an entire village get gassed, spoiler alert, does seem a touch heavier than two men in spandex punching each other because some rich crazy fuckwit told them to, doesn't it? The themes of humanity's tendency towards violence versus their capacity for good, while not entirely original to the genre of comic book films, is handled here in a very unique and interesting way. By the end, the movie's heroine has come to the realization that, yes, humankind is capable of committing truly horrendous things. And she also realizes that such atrocities are not just within human nature, they are also inevitable and bound to reoccur multiple times throughout human history. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that human beings are unforgivable or not capable of bettering themselves. Wonder Woman overcomes the villain's attempts to seduce her to the dark side by reaffirming the innate goodness and capacity for supreme acts of selflessness inside each and every one of us, demonstrated by Steve Trevor's sacrifice at the end. It's a kind of coming-of-age story where the darker realities of human nature are learnt and accepted by the protagonist while she holds on to the aspirations that we can be better. That's honestly kind of profound, especially for a comic book film, and especially compared to the dark, brooding, substanceless messes that made up the previous 3 editions to the DCEU. Wonder Woman was the example of what the DCEU should try to be more like, have more independent, self-contained stories that have a bit more substance and weight to them than the kind of films that Marvel produces, and at the same time having those deep and powerful themes in their stories without devolving into incoherent storytelling and just plain pretentiousness. It was definitely the shot in the arm that we DC fans were all desperately waiting for. And then along came Justice League. Whatever goodwill Wonder Woman built up was almost completely wiped out when the giant mess that was Justice League was released. Although the film received far better reviews than Batman v Superman or Suicide Squad, the reaction from most people was still pretty underwhelming, all things considered. Half the audiences hated it, the rest just thought it was okay, and from a film which should have been the biggest addition to the DCEU yet, DC's closest equivalent to Marvel's Avengers in terms of scale, just being okay kinda doesn't cut the mustard. And this attitude was certainly reflected in the box office returns. The film cost $300 million to produce, making it one of the most expensive films ever made, and that's not counting for the advertising costs, and grossed just over $600 million. While $600 million is a pretty big amount of money for any film to earn, it was nothing like the numbers that Warner Bros. Was expecting one of their biggest projects to bring in. For comparison's sake, let's take a look at some of Justice League's most prominent competitors of that year. Spider-Man Homecoming brought in $880 million on nearly half the budget of Justice League, Logan made $619 million on a far cheaper budget, and if we want to go back even further than 2017, Avengers Assemble, Justice League's nearest equivalent, grossed over $1 billion worldwide and cost $80 million less to make. The point is, it shouldn't have been that hard to make a film titled Justice League a financial success, and Warner Bros. Couldn't even accomplish that. Part of the problem was the amount of disappointment that the DCEU had delivered by that point. Although Wonder Woman may have rekindled some hopes in people that this franchise would turn out better than it started, the bitter taste of Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad still lingered in people's mouths. And this was clearly something Warner Bros. Was conscious of, given the absurd lengths that they went to make Justice League as unlike its predecessors as possible.
Do you bleed? Yeah. Something is definitely bleeding.
But no matter what they tried, I'm doubtful that they really could have done anything to make this movie any better than what we got. From the butchering of characters, to the lazy, boring as hell villain, to that. No amount of tinkering could have made Justice League work, especially when you consider how badly the DCEU was handled up to that point. It's the equivalent of trying to build a new section to a house when the foundations have already been left in ruins. It's doomed to fail no matter what you try. But how exactly did we get to this point? I mean, how did a film that is so widely anticipated as Justice League turn out to be such an underwhelming product? Well, strap yourselves in, because we're about to go into a giant deep dive into the entire history behind this clusterfuck of a movie. Yeah, I know the history parts of these videos are the most boring parts of them, but just bear with me for a couple minutes, okay? Out of all of the DCEU films, Justice League has perhaps the most turbulent and chaotic production history. Batman v Superman, for all of its many faults, didn't have that many problems when it came to its actual production. The creators of the movie may have had a shitty vision, but it was a vision and they stuck to it from beginning to end. And in the case of Suicide Squad, which likewise had a very jumbled road leading to its creation, it wasn't a very long road that it had to travel. The chaos of its production began and ended within 2 years, whereas Justice League's goes back at least a decade. People in Hollywood were talking about making a Justice League movie all the way back in 2007. Originally, a script was penned under the name Justice League Mortal, which actually received positive feedback from studio heads. The filmmakers got the go-ahead to begin the pre-production with George Miller, the mastermind behind the Mad Max franchise, directing, and Barry Osborne producing. A myriad of different actors were considered for the titular characters, with Miller wanting a younger cast who would grow into their roles as the new franchise progressed. The original plan was for Justice League Mortal to begin a new DC franchise, and then subsequent sequels and spin-offs would go more into the characters' backstories and set up other movies. Kind of an inverse of what Marvel did with the Avengers. But then the writer's strike of 2008 happened, which created a whole host of problems. Production was pushed back by 3 months and then fast-tracked by Warner Brothers, who wanted to film most of the movie in Australia, Miller's home country. But then the movie ran into more problems when the Australian government denied Warner Brothers a 40% tax rebate, as they felt that they hadn't cast enough Australian actors in the lead. Production was also delayed because of an ongoing legal battle with the estate of Joe Shuster, one of the co-creators of Superman, over the film rights to the character. With continual delays pushing Justice League Mortal's production back further and further, as well as Warner Brothers shifting its focus into developing more standalone comic book films like The Dark Knight and Man of Steel, it looked like whatever original script had been devised for Justice League would never see the light of day. Having gotten frustrated with waiting around for production to begin, George Miller jumped ship and the film was pushed back until the release and subsequent success of Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, which of course led to the creation of that scrappy little movie universe that we're talking about today. A new Justice League film was announced, one which would be incorporated into the DCEU, with the original 2007 script being scrapped completely and a new one written by David Goyer and Chris Terrio. Finally, in April of 2016, filming of Justice League begins, with Snyder at the helm and Ben Affleck serving as executive producer. But, as is to be expected by this point, problems arose very quickly once again. Firstly, after the blistering reception received by Batman v Superman, there was a desire among the studio heads for Justice League to distance itself from the dour and drab tone of previous DCEU films in order to appease wide audiences. Treading old waters there, I see. Jeff Johns, who had been brought in to spearhead the DCEU's creation, did several rewrites of the Justice League script while the movie was in the process of being filmed, causing tensions between himself, Chris Terrio, and Warner Brothers executives. Warner Brothers themselves were especially anxious about how the film was shaping up under Snyder after the wide derision of Batman v Superman. A footage summit was allegedly held for writers including Joss Whedon, Alan Heinberg, the writer for Wonder Woman, and several others, leading to a tremendous number of rewrites whilst the movie was in the process of being made. And then, all of these problems reached their climax when Zack Snyder stepped down as director during post-production upon the sudden and unexpected death of his daughter. Subsequently, Joss Whedon, who had worked on some of the film's rewrites, took over the post-production stage in Zack Snyder's place. Several very expensive reshoots took place, many of which involved Cavill returning as Superman, which of course led to the whole CGI mustache removal thing due to scheduling conflicts with the recently released Mission Impossible movie. But finally, after a long chaotic road of production changes and mishaps, Justice League was finally released to the public on November 17th, 2017. And the reaction from the masses to the movie, which had taken so goddamn long to make, was meh. Yep, by this point, no one even really cared that much to get worked up about it. There wasn't the same kind of disappointment and rage like there was from fans after the release of Batman v Superman. Most people who watched Justice League were either underwhelmed or passively entertained. And given how this was meant to be one of the biggest movies in the DCEU's lineup, combined with how much time and energy had gone into the film's production, I don't think it's unfair to ask that maybe we could have gotten something a little bit better. But that's enough history. Let's actually start talking about what makes this movie so bleh. One of Justice League's major problems, which as has been established multiple times by this point is also a problem with the DCEU as a whole, is its inconsistent tone. And just like with Suicide Squad, it's easy to pinpoint where this problem originated. Thanks to the fact that both Zack Snyder and Joss Whedon worked on this project, each with very differing visions in mind, it's plain to see why Justice League turned out to be such a jumbled mess. I mean, just take this opening as an example. With an intro like this, the movie is telling the audience that this is going to be a dark film in the same vein as Batman v Superman. I mean, you've got the sad music playing, the gritty visuals, the harsh reality of this comic book movie. But then, in the same film, we also get scenes like this.
Yeah. Oh, something something is definitely bleeding.
Instant clashing of tones right there. Again, much like Suicide Squad, Justice League can't decide if it wants to be serious and gritty or light-hearted and comedic. It doesn't know what film that it wants to be. But we've already covered that kind of stuff in the Suicide Squad video. The more prevalent problem with Justice League's tonal issues is how it affects the franchise as a whole. One of the major issues with the DCEU, which Justice League highlights more than any of the others in my opinion, is that none of these films feel like they occupy the same universe. Batman v Superman doesn't feel like it takes place in the same world as Suicide Squad or Justice League, or if the trailers are to be believed, the upcoming Shazam and Aquaman movies. The two films which feel the closest like each other in terms of world building and visual aesthetic would be Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, probably because they hadn't gotten quite as much backlash for the darker tone by that point. After the catastrophe that was Batman v Superman, Warner Brothers was eager to show that they were listening to the complaints lodged at them by audiences and critics alike, specifically surrounding the overly grim tone that they thought would make a surefire success of their franchise. They basically went, hey, Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy was dark and grim and people like that, so let's just make the DCEU exactly like that as well. Never mind that the plots are idiotic, the scripts are shoddy, and the casting choices are terrible. If it's really grim and dark, people will go to see it. And then when Batman v Superman came out and everyone hated it, they suddenly went, actually, people don't like everything to be grim, dark, and uber realistic, so let's just go ahead and change course on the DCEU so everything's a little bit lighter and funnier now. You know, like Marvel. And this is another problem I just want to quickly touch on. It's painfully clear that a lot of Justice League's construction was taken wholesale from the first Avengers film. Everything from the plot, to the climax, to the main MacGuffin of the story taking the form of a cube, albeit 3 of them, all of that stuff is lifted from the first major crossover film in the MCU. The fact that the plot of Justice League so closely resembles Avengers, which Joss Whedon also directed, just highlights how uninspired the whole DCEU thing has been up to this point. Warner Brothers literally couldn't think of a single other thing to do with the Justice League movie other than to copy their rivals beat for beat. Even the upcoming Aquaman movie looks like a whiter, undersea version of Black Panther, which itself was kind of a rip-off of Lion King, which itself was based on and subsequently ripped off Hamlet. Maybe it's just Hollywood is out of ideas in general and I shouldn't complain about this particular example. But getting back to my larger point about the forced lighter elements of Justice League, this is a problem which plagues a lot of movie productions to this day. The studio head stupidly assumed that the reason for a movie's failure centers around audiences not liking the sum of its parts, not on the actual quality of the film itself. To the studio, the reason that the DCEU is failing isn't because the movies are bad, it couldn't possibly be because of that, it's because audiences just don't like grim, dark comic book movies. The reason for Batman v Superman's failure wasn't that it wasn't any good, it's because darker toned comic book films just aren't popular anymore. Hence why when it came to making Suicide Squad and Justice League, the studio mandate was make it lighter or no one will go to see it. But the irony is that in trying to bring a lighter tone to Suicide Squad and Justice League just to appease the fans out of nowhere, it just makes the films that much worse, such to the point that they don't even feel like they belong in the same franchise. To compare again to Marvel, because it wouldn't be a DCEU rant video without at least one comparison, it's a lot easier to believe that most of the films in the MCU occupy the same universe than in the DCEU. It's not that far to believe that the Iron Man films occupy the same world as, say, Doctor Strange or Captain America. It's pretty easy to believe that while the Guardians of the Galaxy are off doing their own thing, Thor is wielding his hammer and kicking ass. The tones and visual aesthetics between the films are similar enough and consistent enough that it's easy for us to buy that they occupy the same space. With the DCEU though, where the tones are just constantly swinging from these two extremes, either being really grimdark or light, fluffy and entertaining and comedic, it's hard to get sucked into its world building because there's no consistency with it. We're supposed to believe that the same universe with stuff like this
Do you bleed?
is the same universe which includes stuff like this.
Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
Is it meant to be grim or upbeat? Is it dark and serious or light and comedic? It can't decide on anything that it wants to be, which kind of makes it nothing, really. Because of the studio's obsession to cater to each and every member of its fan base, whilst at the same time trying to address each and every single criticism leveled at them, they just ended up throwing a whole bunch of tones at the wall just to see what would stick. And while I do appreciate the attempt to move away from shit like this,
To your blade.
and add a more light-hearted tone to this franchise, it just makes the thing kind of harder to watch because it just seems to be all over the map. No one's saying that the DCEU's tone didn't need to be changed. I mean, we were all complaining about the overly grim darkness all the way back with Batman v Superman and Man of Steel. But all Warner Brothers needed to do to fix the problems was add just a hint more levity and a touch less dourness and things would have been fine. The subtlest of changes does the most good. They didn't need to swing between these two extremes just for the sake of appeasing the fans. And by doing this, all they did was make the fabric of the DCEU's makeup even more incoherent by changing every aspect of its tone and its characters. And speaking of the characters, another big problem with Justice League is just how badly it treats its characters, or more specifically, how the characters are written. Now, to give some credit where it is due, in terms of character interactions, Justice League actually does a half-decent job on that front. Most of the League have at least some form of chemistry with one another, except for painful scenes like this.
That's the plan. Okay, we're not ready for racially charged.
Batman and Wonder Woman have a good dynamic with each other, which actually feels like something of a maturation from the last film. In Batman v Superman, they both had a kind of flirtatious sexual tension with one another, which was one of the few good instances of character development in that movie. But here, though, they actually have something more akin to a business dynamic, like a partnership sort of thing. They're both dedicated to seeing this league of superheroes formed because they both understand the danger that's on the horizon. They're both on level playing fields in terms of characters, without it turning into a cliche romance, which is actually kind of refreshing in a movie like this. Batman and the Flash have a cool mentor/student dynamic with each other, and while it is painfully lifted from Marvel with Iron Man and Spider-Man being the clearest examples, it's still good to see, and it's done pretty goddamn well here, all things considered. The only oddballs in terms of character dynamics would be Superman and Cyborg, but we'll get to them in a minute. The problem with Justice League isn't the interactions between the characters, it's the characters themselves. Part of the problem is that, much like the tone of the movie, a lot of the characters that are introduced in previous DCEU movies were completely changed for this one. Wonder Woman went from being a deep, multi-layered, fascinating, and inspiring character to being a typical badass woman stereotype, with the hung up on her ex trope slapped onto her for no real good reason.
I once knew a man who would have loved to fly it.
Superman's presence in the movie is so small that he barely even has any character to speak of, and he is arguably the biggest character in the Justice League. Cyborg has absolutely no character to him whatsoever other than a stereotypical tragic backstory. But the award for ultimate character butchering has got to go to Ben Affleck's Batman, one of the only good elements of Batman v Superman who is nerfed and watered down to the max in Justice League. Batman in BVS was, for all of his bizarre character contradictions, easily one of the standouts of that movie. He was calm, collected, and charismatic as Bruce Wayne, he was intense and brutal as Batman, and he was brooding and quietly angry during his interactions with Alfred. Affleck pulled that off really, really well, and it was downright painful to watch what they did to him in Justice League.
Yeah. Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
Rather than the angry, brooding, quietly intense Batman of BVS, instead we got a Batman who gets his ass kicked continuously, does even less connected to investigation and stealth than in the last film, and makes jokes.
Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
Yeah, one of these things doesn't seem like the other, does it? This is another example of what I mean when I say that none of these movies feel like they take place in the same universe. The Batman of this movie feels like a completely different character than he did in Batman v Superman. While I may not have liked every aspect of his portrayal in that movie, it did feel like I was getting some kind of cinematic whiplash when I watched the Justice League Batman for the first time. I cannot, in my heart of hearts, believe that the same Batman who said this
To your blade.
would say something like this no more than one movie later.
Something is definitely bleeding.
In a strange way, what Warner Brothers or Zack Snyder or Joss Whedon or whoever you want to blame for this monstrosity, what they did to Batman was kind of the same sort of problem of what they did to Superman in Man of Steel. Take a character who was meant to be one way and turning him into an entirely different creature. In the same way Superman doesn't fit the mold of being super grim dark, so the inverse also applies to Batman. He doesn't suit the jokey joke light-hearted tone that Justice League is trying to go for. If you take a look at any other Justice League related media, such as the excellent animated series, which I recommend that you check it out if you haven't already, Batman's darker, more brooding nature stands in contrast with the more hopeful and optimistic heroes like Superman, Flash, and Wonder Woman.
They were training me, turning me into a weapon for justice, they said. They got their weapon. I got cheated out of my childhood.
I know what that's like.
You do, don't you? I'm dying very soon.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Could you stay with me? I'm scared.
How freaking powerful is that? How much insight does that give you into this guy's character? Doesn't that just resonate with you so much more than this?
Something is definitely bleeding.
The problem with all of these changes is that much like a lot of the DCEU, they aren't changes that work in the context of the stories that they're trying to tell. By degrading Batman into kind of the comic relief of the Justice League, like the poor powerless hapless human who struggles to keep up with the real immortal superheroes, you take away a major component of the group, the down-to-earth realist who keeps the team in check. If you're going to inject more humor and a more light-hearted tone into the DCEU, please feel free, go wild with it if you want, but don't include it in a character where it doesn't belong, like Batman. In the same way you shouldn't include uber grim dark elements in characters like Superman. And this isn't the only example of bad characterization in Justice League. Part of the problem doesn't really have anything to do with the writing per se, it's all to do with the fact that we, the audience, barely get to spend any time with these people. And that's a really big problem. As has been mentioned by a lot of people, part of the DCEU's problem is the stupid decision to have multiple key characters introduced in one movie, rather than giving them their own individual installments through which we can form a connection. There's a reason that we feel more connected to the cast of the Avengers than we do to a single solitary character in the entirety of Justice League. We already know these people, we've gotten to know them a little bit already. Now we can see them work off of each other and even develop. In the case of Justice League, however, where it just drops you right in the middle of the thing, whilst at the same time cramming in a bunch of setup to half the cast, which could have simply been done in earlier films, forging a connection to any of them can be very difficult. But strangely, it can be more difficult for some characters more than others. For instance, it's not that hard to relate to and get on board with the Flash's character for a couple of reasons. One, his particular brand of comedy is one of the few examples of it that doesn't feel painfully forced in the movie.
What's the plan? Okay, we're not ready for racially charged.
For the most part. And there's some genuinely authentic charm to him that's easy to get sucked into. There's character there, there's personality there, there's someone that you can get invested in with this guy. In terms of the rest of them, Aquaman has little character outside of a generic surfer dude archetype, which they thought would be a good direction to go for some reason. Cyborg is just there for plot-related reasons, not much else. He's got nothing to his character whatsoever. And Superman. Oh boy, Superman. Okay, here's my problem with Superman in this movie. Other than the fact that his only real purpose is to serve as an indestructible MacGuffin at the end of the movie to beat the bad guy, which lends credence to the notion notion that any superhero movie involving Superman is going to be hard to make interesting, seeing how the guy who is the main character is next to unbeatable. His appearance in this movie leaves pretty much the entire last half hour of BVS even more pointless than it already was. I mean, you have that big character death happen at the end of that movie, which itself was already kind of dumb because you did it way too early in this franchise, and then just bring him back courtesy of sci-fi mumbo jumbo, thereby rendering whatever emotional catharsis that you were trying to go for in the last movie null and void, and making it impossible for us to be the least bit invested the next time you try a fake out with his death later on down the line. It's the same thing that everyone was complaining about with Loki in the Marvel franchise. If you just keep killing him off and then just bringing him back in the very next movie, it's gonna be hard for us to give much of a shit when it turns out, oh, actually, he is properly dead for real this time. Now that Superman's had his death and come back because of the sci-fi nonsense that they established in the movie that really I just could not follow for the life of me, there's no tension or emotional investment in whether or not he'll live in any future movies that he appears in. Not to mention the fact that 1, he has such little character in this film, 2, he's only thrown in there for the sake of beating the bad guy at the end, and 3, he just looks plain weird. And on the subject of bad characters in this movie, let's go ahead and talk about that villain. Yeah, this guy sucks. I mean, he sucks really, really hard. Not counting the fact that the CGI used to create his entire body is noticeable as fuck. Seriously, you couldn't do anything to make those effects look even a little bit better. He's also one of the laziest, most terribly written antagonists that I have ever seen in a film, let alone a comic book film. His motivations are generic, his look is generic, how he fights is generic, his lines are generic, everything about him is stock comic book villain tropes wrapped up in a giant bloated CGI bow. It's pretty goddamn terrible. This is yet another big failing of this movie. Again, this is supposed to be the Justice League, one of the big standout movies of the DCEU. It needs a big villain, or at least a villain who has some kind of presence or connection to the other characters, or some kind of charisma. Again, I know it's kind of cruel to do this, but compare this CGI monstrosity to Loki from the first Avengers film. For one thing, the guy is actually there, which is always a plus. But aside from that, not only does Loki have a personal connection to one of the Avengers, but he also exudes massive amounts of charisma every time he's on screen. I mean, it's Tom Hiddleston. I mean, that's perfect casting choice right there. And it's hugely fun to watch him because he looks like he's having so much fun playing this role. He is a villain that you can enjoy watching. This guy, though, I was honestly hard-pressed to even remember his name when I came out of the movie. I bet half of you are watching this can't even remember his name without looking it up, can you? But hey, maybe I should give this guy the benefit of the doubt. According to the actor who played him, who by the way wasn't very happy with the final cut of the film, and that's coming from a guy who worked on it, there was apparently a lot more to his character which cut from the finished product, so maybe there's more depth to him than I'm taking for granted. But you know, even if that was the case, I still wouldn't think that this guy was a good villain for one single solitary moment right here.
Its power will cleanse this world for the unity for Darkseid.
And this leads me to another big problem with this lazy as hell villain. Like most things in the DCEU, his only real purpose is to set up yet another villain in a later film. He's only here so that we can foreshadow yet another upcoming Justice League movie with Darkseid as the baddie. This guy doesn't matter. The guy he's referencing in the next movie matters. He doesn't feel like a fleshed out interesting bad guy because he's just a placeholder for when some other bigger bad guy comes around the corner in the next few movies. Again, compare this to Loki. Even though he was the big bad guy in Avengers and was working under Thanos during that time, he was still his own character outside of what was going on in that film. He had personal motivations, he had depth, he had layers to him which they explore in the later films. He actually goes through an arc from an emotionally unstable megalomaniacal villain to a self-sacrificing anti-hero. The writers handling him took time and care to make him engaging and interesting. Here though, even if the writers had the best of intentions to make this guy interesting, they evidently couldn't survive the Warner Brothers studio mandate of setting up as many later films in their doomed franchise as possible. And I'm not saying that this had to be a really in-depth, complex villain like Loki, Thanos, or Killmonger, but maybe making him a little bit more charismatic or intimidating, or at least fun to watch, might have made me care a little bit more about what the Justice League were actually fighting against. Also, random quick little side note, how come it took a giant superpowered army to beat this guy hundreds of years ago, but now all it takes is 6 people to take him down? What the hell kind of sense does that make? I mean, I know you've got Superman on your side, but still, there's only 6 of you. It took a whole army to beat him beforehand, and now you've just got this whole thing in the bag like it's nothing? Seriously? Having such a crappy and forgettable antagonist like this is the surefire way to make a movie as big as this dead on arrival. Your hero is only going to be as good as your villain, and with a story with this many heroes, you would better damn well make sure that your villain is something that the audience is going to remember. And you couldn't even accomplish that. That is an epic fail if ever I've ever heard one. I can't pretend like Justice League is the worst movie to come out of the DCEU, because it isn't, and it certainly has some merits to it. The fact that they at least tried to respond to the criticism that they were getting by adding more levity to a franchise criticized for its overly dour tone is a step in the right direction. It just wasn't done in the best, or I would even argue a good way. And I will at least give them credit that they at least tried to make an entertaining movie with Justice League, rather than an uninteresting, overly pretentious, impossible to follow catastrophe like Batman v Superman. But even with that being said, this movie is still a giant mess, as is the entire DCEU by this point. Despite its merits and its attempts to redeem the sins of previous DCEU movies, Justice League is still a massive failure, and it's plain to see why. No matter how hard the movie tries to hide the cracks and slip-ups and painful mistakes of the past, they're still there for all of the world to see, and the problems with earlier additions to the franchise still manage to bleed into this latest one. And that's part of the overall problem with the DCEU, because its foundations with Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, and Justice League are so shaky and so rocky and so unstable, it's damn near impossible that this franchise is going to turn out anything profitable enough to make up for its tremendous losses. Yes, these movies were partial financial successes, but they still failed to attain even a fraction of what the studio was hoping for. Contrary to what many would like to think, the DCEU has failed in both the quality and the financial successes of its movies. So far, there has not been one movie in its whole roster that people can agree is any good. The rest are either hated, forgotten, or just in a permanent state of limbo. It would be naive to assume that any one particular reason caused the DCEU's downfall. It was just a myriad of different things which led to its demise, attaching an overly dark tone or just randomly adding an overly humorous tone to characters for whom it makes no sense, spending more time and effort lazily setting up future movies instead of making the current films any good. All these things I have discussed over the last 4 videos in this series have contributed to the DCEU's collapse. Justice League is credited as being one of the most expensive movies to make of all time, and it barely made anything like the kind of money that Warner Brothers was hoping it would. And even those who did go to see it came out pretty goddamn disappointed. With more and more people catching on to the DCEU's mediocrity, it's easy to see why the whole thing is failing the way it is. Because the ultimate failing of the DCEU, as I have previously stated, is being more concerned with selling than entertaining, with marketing a movie universe than making it coherent, by making safe, calculated, uninspired studio decisions such as lifting plots wholesale from Marvel movies, rather than making anything original. Wonder Woman was a step in the right direction because while yes, the plot and setting is similar in some regards to something like Captain America, the focus is where it needs to be. The characters are fun and engaging, and the story is simultaneously heartfelt, endearing, and at the same time grim and honest about the darkness of humanity, and not in a way that feels pretentious. It pays more attention to its characters and standalone plot, rather than acting as a giant marketing tool by tying into a larger cinematic universe. And maybe after all of the shit that's been said about this monstrosity of a franchise, Warner Brothers will finally have learnt its lesson and begin making films that we actually enjoy watching, Because in all honesty, I want the DCEU to succeed. I don't think there's a comic book fan alive who wants to see it fail. These are some of the best, most memorable characters ever in the history of comic book fiction, so to see their potential be squandered over and over and over again purely because the movie studios couldn't figure out a way to make a coherent franchise just breaks my heart. Maybe the newer batch of movies like Aquaman and Shazam will have learnt their lesson. Maybe they'll actually unlock some of the potential buried within this wreck of a movie franchise, and maybe Warner Brothers will pull the finger out, realize where they went wrong, and we can actually get a DC franchise that's worthy of the name DC. But somehow, I doubt it. So guys, that brings an end to my 4-part series on where I think the DCEU has failed up to this point. If there's anything that you want to contribute, anything that you disagreed with, anything you wanted to add, leave it in the comments down below. I love hearing feedback from you all. And as always, hit the like button, subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Boy, I'm gonna need some whiskey after doing all this.